And I give the call to the member for Moreton.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And I rise to speak on the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Amendment Bilateral Agreement Implementation Bill 2014. And I note that today is the 16th of June, Deputy Speaker, and I know you're aware of what this date is. I know you're a Mad Keen literature fan, and you'd know that today is Bloomsday. It's also my brother Simon's birthday, so happy birthday to my brother. But it's also the day that the Queensland Government officially declared the Galilee Basin State Development Area. The SDA is designed to facilitate rail corridors between proposed new mines in the Galilee Basin and the Abbott Point coal terminal, right on the Great Barrier Reef. And this basically gives power to the state government to compulsorily acquire properties to build rail lines under the State Development and Public Works Organisation Act, irrespective of whether the farmers on that route object to that. Now, this point illustrates perfectly some of the problems that come with being a federation, because when Australia's constitution was drafted, the environment was not considered to be a significant national issue. So the federal government was not given any explicit power in the constitution to make laws about environmental matters. Obviously, the attitude of the time was, conquer, clear and carve up into productive economic farming units. Obviously, even though we were an urban country at the time the constitution was written and are now, there has been a gradual progression when it comes to environmental law. So as a result of this constitutional silence, there has been some confusion over the years about the division of responsibility for environmental protection between states and the federal government, local governments and local communities. Many of the ad hoc national laws in relation to the environment have been introduced to give effect to Australian obligations triggered by over 90 international environmental agreements that the government has ratified. These agreements or treaties cover topics such as the World Heritage Area, which is important for Queensland because we obviously have the Great Barrier Reef, but also Tasmania and many other areas. I note that the member for Franklin is sitting at the table, at the dispatch box. She'd be very passionate and very aware of the history in terms of environmental protection afforded Tasmania under those treaties. I think she might have had an F-111 fly over at one stage just to work out what was going on a few years back under Prime Minister Hawke. Obviously, the other topics such as climate change, marine pollution, the recording of pollutants, the remediation of land and biodiversity management, particularly preventing the extinction of species. In an attempt to clarify confusion between state and federal environmental powers and to make sure that Australia complies with its international obligations, the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Bill was introduced to take on responsibility for developments that have the potential to impact upon matters of national environmental significance. I repeat that phrase. It's very important here that everyone in Australia understand. This parliament is concerned via the EPBC with the matters of national environmental significance. The EPBC was introduced in 1999 as a piece of fundamental legislation for Australia by the Howard government. I commend them for it. Australian state and territory governments undertook shared responsibility for protecting our natural resources. After more than 10 years with the current legislation, negotiations began about the readiness to negotiate the transfer of environmental approval powers. At COAG in December 2012, Prime Minister Gillard made the right decision to delay that transfer, indicating that more work needed to be done to progress such bilateral agreements. Obviously, we need to get it right. When we don't get it right, species disappear, habitats are destroyed, we breach our international treaty obligations. One reason cited by Prime Minister Gillard for the government's hesitation is the need to ensure that high environmental standards will be consistently maintained across all jurisdictions. We would hate to have 9 different applications and 9 different sets of red tape that only confuse businesses. Now, without proper consultation and recognition of the severe consequences that come with handing over the decision-making power to state and territory governments, the Abbott government will remove federal protection of our native flora, fauna, ecological communities and heritage places such as the Great Barrier Reef, effectively taking a step back to the bad old days. My major concern about this legislative amendment is that the states and territories are overly dependent on royalty revenues from the extractive sector, from the mining sector. So the proposed bilateral agreements could mean the business sector would face an even more complex regulatory environment due to the significant variations in different states' environmental regulation frameworks. The one-stop shop model that was behind this legislation in the first place that the Abbott government is actually putting forward will actually harm the natural environment. It gives powers to states and territories that will see reduced protection for our nationally threatened species, our World Heritage Regions, our wetlands, our migratory species and Commonwealth marine parks, including the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park in my home state of Queensland. Throughout the 1960s, the Bjelke-Petersen government in Queensland actually advocated oil drilling on the Great Barrier Reef, the largest living structure on the planet and one of the most complex ecosystems. In 1973, the Whitlam government passed the Seas and Submerged Lands Act, which gave the Commonwealth authority over the states in matters concerning seas surrounding Australia. This legislation was used to block the Bjelke-Petersen government's plans to allow oil drilling on the Great Barrier Reef. And whilst the Queensland and New South Wales governments challenged this legislation in the High Court, the court actually found that the Commonwealth powers were constitutionally valid. Then in 1975, the Whitlam government created the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park and created an authority to manage it for the future generations. The organisation continues to perform this function today, and by 1983 the marine park had been progressively expanded, becoming the largest marine park in the world. What a great legacy for a government, a Labor government of course. Sad to say that on the day after the LNP government was elected in Queensland in March 2 years ago, the Deputy Premier announced that he wanted to see the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park contract become smaller. He didn't mention it in the lead-up to the election, but it's part of that LNP tradition. And I'll just quickly list some of the other things the LNP government has done. Removed laws to protect, there's 21 items here, but I'll go quickly. Removed laws to protect urban areas from mining, axed future conservation areas, they bulldozed tree clearing laws, and released millions of litres of contaminated mine water. They cancelled every renewable energy project. They limited rights in terms of appropriate development. They commenced logging in state reserve, expanded oil shale extraction and production, opened up national parks to grazing, partnered with the mining industry. They introduced pay to damage laws. They affected bats. They removed riparian vegetation protection, sacked hundreds of public servants, especially in the Environmental Department, defunded the Environmental Defender's Office, the axed wild river protections, abolished the waste levy, cut funds to koala organisations, gutted the coastal protection laws, recommenced uranium mining and extended sand mining. They fire up dormant coal-fired power stations and remove the need for local councils to account for sea level rises in their planning laws. That's just a snapshot of what the state government in Queensland has done. Obviously, handing approval of powers to the states, like Queensland, will not lead to more efficient or effective processes. The already stretched resources of state governments, particularly where they've had public servants sacked, especially the more experienced ones with the corporate knowledge, will mean that the approval processes will be convoluted and unpredictable and not reliable. Earlier this month, the Newman government in Queensland announced 5 so-called megaports would be allowed along the state's coast under this blueprint for dredging programs near the reef. Abbott Point, near Bowen in the state's north, one of the world's biggest coal terminals, was declared a port development priority area under the Queensland Port Strategy, along with Gladstone, Hay Point, Mackay and Townsville. A recent report by UNESCO has found that the Newman government cannot be trusted with the protection and management of our greatest natural asset, the Great Barrier Reef. Great consequences for tourism. The UNESCO report raised significant concerns with the health and management of the Great Barrier Reef and has recommended it be considered listing it as in danger at its next session. UNESCO will make a ruling at their World Heritage Committee meeting in Doha, and I hope that this warning will be a wake-up call for the current governments, both at the national level and state level. The first thing the Newman government should do is take back responsibility for enforcing, monitoring and reporting on water quality in the Great Barrier Reef catchment, which it abandoned soon after coming to government, which is a licence to pollute, effectively. Some environmental groups have noted that the proposed changes to the EPBC would lead to a culture of litigation in the environmental movement, creating a situation in which developments are caught up in an increasing number of lawsuits as communities go through other avenues to protect their wildlife and land, whereas the EPBC was all about making it simpler. The situation on the Great Barrier Reef is telling. According to the Australian Institute of Marine Science, 50% of the coral on the Great Barrier Reef has been lost since 1960. We all know that state governments have a direct stake in major developments, particularly when it comes to the money they will receive from mining royalties, particularly in a budget where the federal government has cut off much funding to them, $80 billion just cut overnight in the budget a few weeks back. Without federal intervention, there would be oil rigs on the Great Barrier Reef and a dam on the Franklin River. So with half of the Great Barrier Reef's coral lost already, we are on the cliff of an unprecedented and massive port and shipping expansion that could turn the reef into an industrial highway for supertankers. In fact, it could be an increase of 480 extra ships a year if the Carmichael mine, when it reaches full production. Not just a few, we're talking a projected 7,000 supertankers passing through the reefs every year. And as I said, the Newman government has just granted approval for the Galilee Basin coal mine, despite serious environmental concerns raised by experts appointed by the Commonwealth. And the $16.5 billion Carmichael project would also add to that, in terms of producing about 60 million tonnes of coal a year, a mine covering 200 square kilometres. Incredible. Obviously, the EPBC Act was put into place to protect matters of national environmental significance, and the federal government should have oversight of this and protect matters of national interest, and so that we can fulfil our World Heritage, Ramsar and other international obligations. When it comes to international obligations, the Australian public do not have confidence, sadly, in our state governments, be they Labor or Liberal, or anything in between. One reason for this is that it is not just one state alone. It should not be one state alone that decides whether a matter that is of national or international significance should be protected, which is why the EPBC Act was put into place in the first case after the Tasmanian Dam case. Given the evidence of how state laws and state capacities are not adequate to fulfil national and international environmental obligations, environment groups, environmental lawyers and the Australian public do not have confidence that this process should go ahead. In fact, in a recent Queensland audit report, so this is a Queensland Government entity, the Audit Office regarding mining and waste resource industries in Queensland and how effectively they are being managed by the Department of Environment in Queensland, there was the following statement, and I quote, "The Department of Environment and Heritage Protection is not fully effective in its supervision, monitoring and enforcement of environmental conditions and is exposing the state to liability and the environment to harm unnecessarily." End quote. That's from the Queensland Government's own audit report into how effective it can be as a policeman on the beat, police officer on the beat. This is the Queensland Audit Office that actually reports to the Queensland Government that shows that there is an inability for the state government to effectively protect our natural resources. I, like the rest of the Labor Party, oppose the bilateral agreement implementation in its current form and the hand-down of powers to states through the EPBC amendments presented to the House. I would ask the LNP members who are able to vote according to their conscience, particularly the Queensland members of Parliament with the Great Barrier Reef at their doorstep, such as the member for Herbert. I'm sure he'll be able to be a free-thinking individual and make a decision that benefits his community, which is heavily reliant on tourism. And he will know that we should be doing all that we can to protect the Great Barrier Reef, to protect the reefs off Magnetic Island, the tourism connected with that. So I'd ask the LNP, all of the LNP, but particularly those Queensland LNP members, to consider their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren and do likewise. Just say no. Just say no. You know it makes sense. Obviously the LNP members are able to make an individual decision any time they want when it comes to a piece of policy. I've only seen 2 or 3 of them actually have the guts to cross the floor when it came to a piece of policy. Obviously, the Labor Party is bound by caucus rules. That you'd have to be an idiot not to know that. You'd have to be an idiot not to know that the Labor Party is bound by caucus rules. But obviously, Exhibit A speaks up. The reality is, the environmental protection piece of legislation before the chamber does not protect the environment. It undermines the very piece of legislation that John Howard and other environment ministers were proud of. The reality is, I can speak with some authority on what goes on in Queensland. We do not have a state that is effective when it comes to policing its own environmental laws. It has no chance when it is bound
to the profits from royalties from the mining industry of making the right decision.
I thank the member for more.